I never thought I'd see the day when my son's wife, the woman he adored and trusted with his entire heart, would look me in the eye and tell me to go die in the cabin. Those words weren't just cruel. They were a knife twisted deep inside me. I'd already lost my husband in a sudden accident decades ago, and now my only son was gone too. Losing Daniel shattered me, but Melissa's betrayal crushed whatever pieces I had left. And before I go on, let me say this. These stories take me hours upon hours to write, edit, and share with you all. If you find yourself hooked by what you're hearing, I'd truly appreciate it if you subscribed. It's the least you can do for an old woman pouring her heart out into telling the truth. My name is Eleanor, and I'm 67 years old. I've lived most of my life in the quiet countryside of Northern California. I married young, lost my husband in a car accident near Sacramento when our boy was only 8, and from then on, it was just me and Daniel. That boy became my reason to keep living. He was brilliant from the very start, always tinkering with gadgets, pulling apart old radios, and later teaching himself coding back when people didn't even understand what that word meant. I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, but Daniel's determination made every sacrifice worth it. He grew into a man who built one of the biggest tech companies in Silicon Valley from scratch, and by the time he was in his 40s, he had more money than I could even wrap my head around. But he never changed. Despite his wealth and power, he called me every single night, and he even built me a small cabin on the property, so I'd never feel far from him. He was my pride, my everything. And then came Melissa. From the very first time he introduced us, I felt something deep in my gut warning me. She was the type who could light up a room, all charm and polish, but when the door closed, that warmth disappeared. To me, she was cold, dismissive, like I was just some unwanted piece of baggage Daniel carried out of obligation. Still, I stayed quiet for Daniel's sake. He loved her, and that was all that mattered to me. When Daniel died suddenly last year, I thought at the very least, Melissa and I would share our grief. That maybe, just maybe, tragedy would bridge the distance between us. Instead, only a few days after his funeral in San Francisco, where we buried him on a hillside overlooking the bay, Melissa summoned me to the mansion under the pretense of sorting through Daniel's things. I walked through the grand foyer, my hands clutching the sweater Daniel had given me on my last birthday. She stood there, arms folded, her designer heels clicking against the marble floor. "You know everything is mine now, right?" she said coldly. "The company shares, the house, the accounts." Daniel made sure of that. I swallowed the lump in my throat and nodded, too broken to fight. "I know," I whispered. And then she delivered the blow that knocked the breath out of me. "You're not welcome here anymore. Go die in that little cabin." I froze. Her words rang in my ears like church bells on the day of a funeral, heavy and unrelenting. Here was a woman who had just inherited over $73 million, looking at me as though I was nothing more than a burden, an animal she couldn't wait to be rid of. For a moment, I wanted to scream at her, to remind her that without me there would be no Daniel, no empire, no fortune. But grief and rage sat so heavy on my chest that I couldn't force out the words. Instead, I turned silently, walked out of the mansion, and let the heavy oak door slam behind me. As I made my way down the stone path to my cabin, my eyes blurred with tears. I whispered under my breath, almost like a prayer or a curse, "You'll regret this, Melissa. You don't know who you're dealing with." That night, I sat by the fire in my cabin, the flames dancing while my heart cracked open again and again. Memories of Daniel washed over me. The day he surprised me with a bouquet of wildflowers after getting his first paycheck, the nights when he promised me I'd never have to be alone, the way he always made time for me no matter how big his world became. And now, because of the woman he trusted, I was left to rot in the shadows of the life he built. But something shifted in me that night. The sorrow began to harden into something else. I thought about the years I spent raising Daniel alone, scraping by, finding ways to survive when the world seemed determined to crush me. If Melissa believed she could erase me from Daniel's legacy, she was sorely mistaken. Because I realized then and there, I would not die in that cabin. I would fight back, not with fists or shouting, but with patience, precision, and a quiet kind of vengeance that she would never see coming until it was too late. As the fire flickered lower and the night wrapped around the cabin, I made myself a promise. Melissa thought she had won, but in reality, her downfall had already begun. And I'll ask you this, if you were in my shoes, would you just accept what she did and fade away quietly? Or would you rise and take back the dignity she tried to steal? Have you ever been betrayed so deeply by someone you tolerated for the sake of love? Let me know, because I can tell you this much. The choice I made that night set everything into motion. Melissa had no idea that the woman she told to go die in the cabin was about to become her greatest nightmare. The morning after Melissa's words echoed in my cabin like a curse, I woke up with swollen eyes and a pounding heart. The grief was still there, raw and jagged, but underneath it simmered something new: resolve. I brewed myself a pot of strong coffee, the kind Daniel used to tease me about for being strong enough to wake the dead, and I sat by the window watching the mist roll through the redwoods. Melissa thought she had cast me aside, tucked me away like a forgotten relic. What she didn't realize was that I wasn't going to fade quietly into the background. I was going to make her regret every word she had said. I started small. That's the secret to revenge. Not grand gestures, not explosions, but a slow burn that eats away at someone until they collapse under the weight of their own arrogance. And in this case, I had advantages Melissa didn't even know about. I had lived alongside Daniel as he built his empire from nothing. I wasn't just the widow in the cabin. I knew things about the company, about his contacts, about the delicate balance of relationships he had carefully maintained. I had been his sounding board for years, the person he trusted with his fears, his strategies, even his plans for the future. Melissa had inherited Daniel's money and assets, yes, but she hadn't inherited his knowledge. That stayed with me. My first move was subtle. I began calling a few of Daniel's oldest friends in the industry, men and women who had known him long before the world did. Some of them lived down in Los Angeles, some in Seattle, and others were scattered across the tech hubs of the country. These weren't just colleagues. They were people who respected Daniel deeply, people who knew me as the mother who had supported him every step of the way. When they heard how Melissa had treated me just days after burying my son, their disgust was immediate. One of them, a venture capitalist in San Jose, told me flatly, "She won't last, Eleanor. She doesn't understand that Daniel's company was built on trust, not greed." That was all I needed to hear. Trust. Melissa thought money alone would hold everything together, but she didn't understand that Daniel's empire was woven with relationships, loyalty, and reputation. Without those, even $73 million couldn't save her. I began pulling small threads. Nothing too obvious, not yet. A quiet word here, a subtle reminder there. I mentioned Melissa's arrogance to the right ears, hinted at her lack of experience, dropped little anecdotes about her dismissive attitude. I didn't need to embellish. Her behavior spoke for itself. Within weeks, I started hearing whispers about her missteps, board members questioning her decisions, investors expressing doubt, old friends of Daniel distancing themselves from her. Meanwhile, back at the mansion, Melissa strutted around like a queen, oblivious to the cracks forming beneath her throne. She'd drive past my cabin in her sleek black Mercedes, windows tinted, never once glancing in my direction. That was fine by me. Let her believe I was just a grieving old woman left to rot in the woods. The more she underestimated me, the more powerful I became. The first real taste of satisfaction came when I heard from one of Daniel's closest confidants, a lawyer in San Francisco, that Melissa had been trying to secure a new deal for the company, something that would have added millions more to her already bloated inheritance. The deal fell through. Why? Because the other party didn't trust her. They respected Daniel, but Melissa? She was just a name on paper, a widow with no backbone in the industry. I poured myself a glass of wine that night and sat on my porch, the cool California air carrying the scent of pine. For the first time since Daniel's death, I smiled. It wasn't joy, not yet, but it was the beginning of something I hadn't felt in a long time: control. Still, I knew this was just the beginning. Revenge wasn't about watching her stumble once. It was about dismantling her world piece by piece until she understood what it meant to take everything from someone. And I would not stop until she was stripped of the empire she had stolen. But here's where I'll pause. and ask you, if someone took everything from you, would you play the long game like I did, slowly pulling at the threads, or would you go for the jugular right away? Have you ever had to pretend to be weaker than you are just to gain the upper hand? Let me know, because the mask I wore as the quiet grieving widow was about to become my most dangerous weapon. And little did Melissa know, the real storm hadn't even begun. The first time I knew my efforts were working came late one evening, when the phone rang in my cabin. It was Jonathan, one of Daniel's oldest friends from his college days at Stanford. His voice was low, almost amused, as he told me, "Melissa's been scrambling. She walked into a board meeting this morning looking like she had everything under control. But within 20 minutes, half the room was questioning her competence." He paused before adding, "It's like they finally see what you and I have seen all along." I hung up the phone and sat in the dim light of my cabin, a small smile tugging at my lips. For weeks I'd been patient, careful, planting seeds of doubt in just the right places. Now, I was starting to see them bloom. Melissa, with all her airs and arrogance, was being forced to face the truth. She wasn't Daniel, and she never would be. Still, I knew this was just the surface. Melissa was proud, and pride makes people reckless. It wasn't enough to let her lose one deal, or be questioned in one meeting. I needed to let her unravel, thread by thread, until her polished facade collapsed for everyone to see. One of my next moves was through Daniel's old charitable foundation, the one he had poured his heart into supporting. He used to say, "Mom, success means nothing if we don't use it to lift others up." That was Daniel's way, humble, compassionate, grounded. Melissa, on the other hand, saw the foundation as a burden, an unnecessary expense draining her precious millions. She cut donations, pulled back from commitments, and dismissed the staff with little more than a sneer. What she didn't realize was that the foundation was beloved in the community. People noticed when programs lost funding. Journalists noticed when scholarships were suddenly pulled. And when one young reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle called me to ask if I'd share my perspective as Daniel's mother, I didn't hold back. I didn't speak with venom, though, no. I spoke with sorrow, with disappointment, with the kind of quiet pain that resonates more deeply than anger. "I just know Daniel would never have wanted his foundation dismantled," I said softly. "He believed in helping others. It breaks my heart to see his legacy treated as disposable." The article hit the front page of the local section a few days later, complete with a photo of me standing outside the cabin Daniel built for me, a tired but determined widow fighting to protect her son's name. And Melissa? She exploded. I heard from Jonathan that she stormed into the office screaming about a smear campaign, accusing everyone of conspiring against her. The irony was delicious. She was her own worst enemy, and I was merely holding up the mirror. But I didn't just want her humiliated publicly. I wanted her to feel the kind of isolation she had forced onto me. Slowly, I began cutting her off from Daniel's inner circle. Friends who once answered her calls suddenly stopped picking up. Business partners grew distant. Even staff members at the mansion began resigning, unwilling to endure her temper or her disregard for Daniel's memory. And then came the first real crack in her perfect little world. Late one night, as I sat knitting by the fire, I heard the roar of her Mercedes speeding up the long driveway. Headlights cut across my cabin walls, and for a split second, I thought she might actually stop and confront me. Instead, the car tore past, screeched to a halt at the mansion, and the sound of a door slamming echoed through the still night air. She was unraveling. The mighty Melissa was losing control, and she didn't even realize I was the one pulling the strings. As I set my knitting aside and listened to the silence that followed, I felt something I hadn't in months. Peace. Not joy, not yet, but peace in knowing that justice had begun. Now let me turn the question to you. If someone tried to erase you from your own child's legacy, would you quietly let it happen, or would you find ways to make sure the world remembered the truth? Have you ever watched someone's arrogance pave the road to their downfall? Because in Melissa's case, her arrogance was the rope tightening around her neck, and I was the one making sure it pulled tighter with every move she made. It didn't take long before Melissa's unraveling became impossible to ignore. The woman who once paraded through the mansion like she owned the world began showing cracks in public. I first noticed it at the grocery store in Palo Alto. I rarely ventured into town these days, preferring the quiet comfort of my cabin. But that day I needed a few essentials. As I walked down the aisle with my basket of bread, tea, and fruit, I saw her, Melissa. She wasn't dressed in her usual designer clothes, no sparkling jewelry, no towering heels. Instead, she looked ordinary. Hair tied back, face pale, eyes shadowed like she hadn't slept in days. She spotted me before I could turn away. For a second, I braced myself for venom, for another cruel remark about dying in the cabin. But to my surprise, her face softened, almost crumbled. "Eleanor," she said quietly, almost pleading, "can we talk?" I stood there, clutching my basket, my heart pounding. She had never once lowered herself to address me in public, unless she was putting on a performance. Now here she was, stripped of all that arrogance. "About what?" I asked flatly. Her lip trembled, and she glanced around like she was afraid someone might overhear. "Things aren't going the way I thought they would. The board is questioning everything. The press is tearing me apart." And she paused, her voice breaking. I don't know who else to turn to. There it was, the first sign of true desperation. She wanted my help. After kicking me out, after sneering at me, after telling me to go die, now she wanted me to save her from the mess she had created. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You should have thought of that before you buried Daniel's legacy under your greed." Then I turned my back and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of that aisle like a ghost of herself. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Part of me wondered if I had been too harsh, if Daniel would have wanted me to show compassion. But then I remembered the way she had stripped his foundation, insulted his memory, and thrown me out like garbage. Compassion had no place here. This wasn't just about me. It was about honoring my son. And Melissa wasn't going to tarnish him any further. The next few weeks proved my decision right. Melissa's pleas became more frequent. She started showing up at my cabin unannounced, her knocks sharp and frantic against the wooden door. Sometimes she'd shout through the walls, "Eleanor, please, just talk to me." Other times, she'd leave letters on the porch, written in messy handwriting that barely resembled her usual elegant script. One of them read, "I don't know how to fix this. I need you. Please." I didn't answer. Not once. I'd sit by the fire, sipping tea, listening to her footsteps retreat into the night. Each unanswered knock was a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. She needed me now more than I ever needed her. But I'll be honest with you. Silence can be a form of revenge, but it can also be exhausting. Every time she knocked, I had to remind myself of the cabin door slamming shut behind me the day she cast me out. I had to remember those words, "Go die in the cabin." She made her choice, and now I was making mine. So let me ask you, if you were in my shoes, would you have opened the door, or would you have left her out there, begging? Have you ever had someone betray you, only to come crawling back when their world fell apart? Melissa thought she could buy loyalty with money and charm. But loyalty isn't bought, it's earned. And hers had run dry the moment she tried to erase me from Daniel's life. And the truth was, her begging was only the beginning. The storm I had set in motion was about to grow darker, bigger, and far more destructive than she could ever imagine. The IT didn't take long before Melissa's unraveling became impossible to ignore. The woman who once paraded through the mansion like she owned the world began showing cracks in public. I first noticed it at the grocery store in Palo Alto. I rarely ventured into town these days, preferring the quiet comfort of my cabin. But that day I needed a few essentials. As I walked down the aisle with my basket of bread, tea, and fruit, I saw her, Melissa. She wasn't dressed in her usual designer clothes, no sparkling jewelry, no towering heels. Instead, she looked ordinary. Hair tied back, face pale, eyes shadowed like she hadn't slept in days. She spotted me before I could turn away. For a second, I braced myself for venom, for another cruel remark about dying in the cabin. But to my surprise, her face softened, almost crumbled. "Eleanor," she said quietly, almost pleading, "can we talk?" I stood there, clutching my basket, my heart pounding. She had never once lowered herself to address me in public, unless she was putting on a performance. Now here she was, stripped of all that arrogance. About what? I asked flatly. Her lip trembled, and she glanced around like she was afraid someone might overhear. Things aren't going the way I thought they would. The board is questioning everything, the press is tearing me apart, and she paused, her voice breaking. I don't know who else to turn to. There it was, the first sign of true desperation. She wanted my help. After kicking me out, after sneering at me, after telling me to go die, now she wanted me to save her from the mess she had created. I looked her dead in the eye and said, "You should have thought of that before you buried Daniel's legacy under your greed." Then I turned my back and walked away, leaving her standing in the middle of that aisle like a ghost of herself. When I got home, I couldn't stop thinking about it. Part of me wondered if I had been too harsh, if Daniel would have wanted me to show compassion. But then I remembered the way she had stripped his foundation, insulted his memory, and thrown me out like garbage. Compassion had no place here. This wasn't just about me, it was about honoring my son. And Melissa wasn't going to tarnish him any further. The next few weeks proved my decision right. Melissa's pleas became more frequent. She started showing up at my cabin unannounced, her knocks sharp and frantic against the wooden door. Sometimes she'd shout through the walls, "Eleanor, please, just talk to me." Other times, she'd leave letters on the porch, written in messy handwriting that barely resembled her usual elegant script. One of them read, "I don't know how to fix this. I need you. Please." I didn't answer. Not once. I'd sit by the fire, sipping tea, listening to her footsteps retreat into the night. Each unanswered knock was a reminder that the balance of power had shifted. She needed me now more than I ever needed her. But I'll be honest with you. Silence can be a form of revenge, but it can also be exhausting. Every time she knocked, I had to remind myself of the cabin door slamming shut behind me the day she cast me out. I had to remember those words, "Go die in the cabin." She made her choice, and now I was making mine. So let me ask you, if you were in my shoes, would you have opened the door or would you have left her out there, begging? Have you ever had someone betray you, only to come crawling back when their world fell apart? Melissa thought she could buy loyalty with money and charm. But loyalty isn't bought, it's earned. And hers had run dry the moment she tried to erase me from Daniel's life. And the truth was, her begging was only the beginning. The storm I had set in motion was about to grow darker, bigger, and far more destructive than she could ever imagine. There's a moment in grief when you stop feeling like a victim and start realizing you've been reforged. For weeks, I had been surviving on anger and spite, letting it guide my choices. But after Melissa's desperate knocks on my cabin door became routine, something inside me shifted again. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was becoming someone new. Stronger, sharper, dangerous in ways Melissa could never predict. Late one night, I sat by the fire reading over Daniel's old journals. He used to jot down ideas for the company, sketches of designs, even notes about potential partners. As I turned the pages, I realized how much of Daniel lived on in those words. Melissa had inherited the empire, but the blueprint of his genius was in my hands. The more I read, the more I understood. I could use this knowledge not just to preserve his legacy, but to tear down the false queen who sat on his throne. My first move was through the company's annual tech conference scheduled in San Francisco. Daniel had always treated it like a sacred event, an opportunity to showcase innovation, connect with visionaries, and inspire the next generation. Melissa, however, saw it as nothing more than a stage for her own vanity. She planned to make a grand entrance, to announce a bold new direction that she barely understood. I knew if I could undermine her there, the consequences would ripple far beyond that single night. So I made a few quiet phone calls. I reached out to contacts Daniel had trusted, engineers, journalists, even an old professor from Stanford who had always admired Daniel's brilliance. I didn't spread lies. I didn't need to. All I did was share the truth. Melissa was reckless, uninformed, and entirely unprepared to lead the company Daniel had built. By the time the conference rolled around, the air was thick with doubt. I didn't attend in person. Instead, I sat in my cabin with the live stream open on my laptop, watching Melissa strut across the stage in a glittering dress, her voice echoing through the auditorium. She spoke of innovation, of bold futures, of continuing Daniel's vision. But it didn't take long for the audience to see through her act. Questions began to fly from the floor. Technical questions, sharp questions, the kind of questions Daniel would have answered effortlessly. Melissa stumbled, faltered, and finally snapped. Her frustration was caught on camera. Her polished smile cracked, and for the first time, the world saw the woman I had known all along. Cold, defensive, and woefully out of her depth. The live stream chat exploded with criticism. Journalists tore her apart in their coverage the next morning. Investors panicked. Shares in the company dipped. I leaned back in my chair and let out a long breath. Watching her unravel so publicly was more satisfying than I had expected. But it wasn't just satisfaction, it was vindication. For the first time since Daniel's death, I felt like I was protecting him again, standing guard over his memory, making sure the wrong person couldn't twist it for her own gain. And while I sat there, surrounded by Daniel's journals, I realized something else. This wasn't just revenge anymore. This was my purpose. I wasn't going to let Melissa destroy what my son built. If she wanted war, she was going to get it. And I would fight it with every ounce of cunning I had left. The fire in the hearth crackled, and I felt the weight of my decision settle over me like armor. I was no longer the grieving widow tucked away in the woods. I was a strategist, a fighter, a mother carrying the torch for her son's legacy. And Melissa? She was just beginning to learn what it felt like to be on the losing side. The fallout from the conference spread faster than wildfire through dry California brush. By the next morning, the headlines were everywhere. Melissa fumbles at tech conference. Widow of visionary CEO struggles to answer basic questions. Is the company in the wrong hands? Every article, every whisper, every meme that circulated online chipped away at the image she had so carefully crafted. I didn't need to lift a finger that day. The world was already watching her stumble, and all I had to do was sit back in my cabin and let the storm roll in. Still, I knew the slow burn of revenge required more than one big moment. Melissa was wounded, but not finished. If I wanted her empire to collapse, I had to keep pressing where it hurt the most. I started by contacting the people who mattered most to the company's survival, the investors. These weren't strangers to me. Many of them had sat at my kitchen table years ago, sipping my coffee while Daniel sketched ideas on napkins and begged for their faith. They remember me not as a bystander, but as part of the foundation. When I called, they listened. And I didn't need to convince them of anything. All I had to do was remind them of the difference between Daniel's vision and Melissa's vanity. Daniel believed in solving problems, I told one man from New York, his voice crackling over the phone. Melissa believes in selling images. They're not the same thing. Within weeks, I began hearing of investors quietly pulling out, redirecting their money to safer ventures. Melissa must have noticed the bleeding accounts, the uneasy phone calls that suddenly ended sooner than she expected. But she didn't know where it was coming from. The stress was eating at her. I could see it in the way she moved. On the rare occasions when her car passed by my cabin, her once perfect posture slouched, and her hands gripped the wheel too tightly. Sometimes she sped down the driveway so fast it was as if she were trying to outrun her own failures. Then came the night I saw her on television, giving a press statement outside the mansion. Cameras flashed as she tried to smile through gritted teeth, her makeup barely masking the exhaustion etched into her face. She rambled about new opportunities and exciting directions for the company, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. The wolves smelled blood, and the media tore into her performance. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat back, my heart steady. For months after Daniel's death, I had felt powerless, erased, insignificant. Now I felt the power humming inside me again, not power for its own sake, but power used with purpose. I was restoring balance, protecting what mattered, and showing Melissa that cruelty has consequences. Still, I knew I couldn't let myself get complacent. The art of the slow burn is patience, but also precision. Too fast and she'd catch on. Too slow and the fire might die out. I had to keep feeding it little by little, until she collapsed under the weight of her own arrogance. And collapse she would. The signs were already there. The empty boardroom chairs, the dwindling accounts, the cracks in her perfect smile. Each day she lost another piece of Daniel's empire, another ounce of her confidence. And each day I gained more strength, more clarity, more resolve. Melissa once told me to go die in the cabin, but the truth was I had been reborn there. The woman she thought she buried was gone. In her place stood someone patient, relentless, and unafraid to burn her world down piece by piece. Melissa always believed money could shield her from consequence. She thought wealth was armor, that her mansion, her car, her designer wardrobe, and her inheritance of $73 million made her untouchable. But money can't buy loyalty, and it certainly can't buy respect. And respect was the first thing to slip through her manicured fingers. The fallout from the conference had been swift, but it was the weeks that followed where the damage began to take shape in ways Melissa never anticipated. Investors grew cautious, board members started whispering about replacement options, and the media smelled blood. But what she hadn't expected, what she had no defense against, was the slow erosion of her social standing, the collapse of the carefully curated life she had built around Daniel's shadow. It started small. One evening, I received a call from a woman named Catherine, one of Daniel's longtime friends from college. She'd been close to him for decades and begrudgingly had tolerated Melissa because Daniel asked her to. "Eleanor," Catherine said over the line, her voice tight with frustration. "I can't keep watching her butcher his legacy." She showed up at a charity gala in Los Angeles last weekend and acted like she was the star of the show. People were whispering about her all night. She doesn't realize she's making a fool of herself. I thanked Catherine, and after we hung up, I sat back in my chair by the fire and let the words sink in. This was exactly what I'd been waiting for. Melissa's arrogance was becoming visible to everyone, not just to me. And once the mask slips in public, it's nearly impossible to put it back on. In San Francisco, at one of the city's most exclusive country clubs, Melissa arrived expecting the usual flattery she had grown accustomed to when Daniel was alive. Instead, the reception was icy. People greeted her politely but quickly turned away, preferring to mingle with others. Conversations she tried to join dissolved into silence. Someone later told me she left the club early, her face pale, her mouth set in a hard line. That same night, a photo surfaced online of her sitting alone at the bar, a glass of wine untouched in front of her, scrolling furiously on her phone while the room buzzed around her. Her social downfall was delicious to watch, but I wasn't content to simply observe. I gave it a gentle push. Through Daniel's old contacts, men and women who still respected me deeply, I began sharing my truth. Not lies, never lies, but truths Melissa had tried to bury. How she gutted Daniel's foundation, how she dismissed staff like they were disposable, how she threw me out of the home my son had built for us. And in today's world, where stories spread like wildfire, it didn't take long for people to start talking. Soon, Melissa wasn't just a widow fumbling at a tech conference. She was the greedy woman who spat on her husband's legacy. Her name became a cautionary tale whispered in Silicon Valley boardrooms and dinner parties in Pacific Heights alike. One of the most striking blows came when the San Francisco Chronicle ran a follow-up piece on the foundation. The headline read, "From Vision to Vanity: How Melissa Holloway is Undoing Her Husband's Legacy." They quoted me sparingly, but the few words they used cut deep. Daniel believed in lifting others up. Melissa only believes in lifting herself. Underneath, they included a photograph of me outside the cabin, the one Daniel had built with his own hands, the golden evening light falling on the weathered wood behind me. That article spread, and with it, Melissa's reputation crumbled. Sponsors pulled out of her upcoming charity gala. Journalists began digging into her spending habits. Social media buzzed with scathing comments, some mocking her, others outright condemning her. Inside the mansion, she must have felt the walls closing in. I imagined her pacing through the echoing halls at night, her heels clicking against marble floors that once rang with Daniel's laughter. The silence of wealth can be deafening when no one's left to admire it. I didn't stop there. Quietly, I began reconnecting with the household staff she had discarded. The gardener who had tended the roses Daniel planted for me. The housekeeper who once slipped me extra bread rolls from the kitchen when I came by. The driver who had been with Daniel since his very first car. One by one, they shared their stories, and I listened. Then I made sure their voices were heard in the right places. Anonymous interviews began appearing in blogs and local papers, painting a picture of Melissa as careless, cruel, and dismissive of those who had been loyal for years. Each revelation was another stone stacked against her. Each whisper grew into a chorus, and then came the moment that cemented her exposure. At a lavish fundraiser in San Francisco, Melissa attempted to reclaim her spotlight. Dressed in a glittering silver gown, she took the microphone to speak about Daniel's vision. But as she droned on, murmurs spread through the crowd. Someone shouted from the back, "What about the scholarships you cut?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Melissa, and for the first time, I think she realized she had lost the room. Her voice faltered, her smile wavered, and she rushed through the rest of her speech before hurrying off stage. The incident was recorded on half a dozen phones. By the next morning, the video had gone viral under the caption, "Melissa Holloway booed at charity gala." I sat at my cabin window with my tea, watching the dawn creep over the redwoods, and I felt an indescribable satisfaction. This wasn't pettiness. This wasn't cruelty. This was justice. For every word she had thrown at me, for every act of disrespect she had shown Daniel's legacy, she was now reaping what she had sown. Still, I knew she wasn't finished fighting. People like Melissa don't go quietly. She would claw, scramble, and beg for control, even as the ground gave way beneath her feet. And in her desperation, she would come knocking again. And that, I realized, was where the real satisfaction would come. Not just in watching her fall, but in watching her beg for help from the very woman she told to die in the cabin. The slow burn had turned into an open flame, and soon, that fire would consume everything she thought she owned. Melissa had always been loud in her victories. When she was admired, she preened. When she inherited, she flaunted. When she thought she'd won, she strutted past my cabin without so much as a glance. But in defeat, she was quiet, desperate, almost unrecognizable. The knocks on my cabin door started as small interruptions, timid taps in the evening, hurried footsteps retreating into the night when I didn't answer. But over time, they grew louder, more insistent. Sometimes she'd bang with the side of her fist until the wood rattled. Other nights, she'd stand on the porch and call my name, her voice strained and brittle. "Eleanor, please. We need to talk. Please." At first, I ignored her. I sat by my fire with Daniel's journals, sipping tea, listening to her footsteps retreat. But one night in late autumn, after the third week of her relentless visits, I decided to let the door swing open. When I did, the sight before me almost made me laugh. Melissa stood there in the glow of the porch light, drenched from the rain, her once perfect hair plastered to her face, mascara streaking down her cheeks. She looked nothing like the woman who once ruled the mansion with arrogance. No designer gown, no diamonds glittering at her throat, just a shivering, broken figure in a soaked trench coat. "Eleanor," she whispered, hugging herself against the cold, "I can't do this anymore. Please, please help me." I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, letting the silence stretch between us. Part of me wanted to slam the door in her face, to remind her of the day she told me to go die in this very cabin. But another part, the mother in me, the part that had spent decades comforting Daniel through his storms, wanted to savor this. Not to forgive, not to comfort, but to see her laid bare. "Help you," I said finally, my voice low. "Funny, I seem to recall you telling me to die out here. Why come knocking now?" Her face crumpled, and she let out a ragged sob. "I was wrong. I didn't know it would be this hard. The board hates me. The press is destroying me. People won't even look at me anymore. Daniel's friends won't return my calls. I thought I could do this, Eleanor, but I can't. I can't." She collapsed onto the porch bench, her hands trembling as she tried to light a cigarette, but the rain had soaked them through. The lighter sparked uselessly, and she cursed under her breath, a sound more pitiful than angry. I watched her struggle for a moment before stepping out onto the porch, pulling my shawl tighter around my shoulders. The air was sharp with the smell of wet pine and earth. "Melissa," I said, "you brought this on yourself. You inherited Daniel's fortune, but you didn't inherit his heart, his mind, or his vision. You gutted his foundation. You dismissed his people. You disrespected his legacy. And you thought money would carry you through it all. I know, she cried, dropping the lighter onto the wet wood. I know I ruined everything. I thought I could handle it. I thought people respected me, but they only ever respected him. Without Daniel, I'm nothing. Her voice cracked on the last word, and she buried her face in her hands. For a long moment, I just stood there, watching her break apart. It wasn't joy I felt, it was justice. The woman who once sneered at me, who once wielded her inheritance like a sword, was now crumbling in the rain outside the cabin she had condemned me to. Please, she whispered again, her voice muffled by her hands. I need you. You know these people. They respect you. If you spoke up for me, if you stood by me, maybe I could salvage this. Maybe they'd listen. I almost laughed at the audacity. After everything, she thought I'd be her savior? She thought I'd use my voice, my credibility, to pull her out of the pit she dug for herself? No, Melissa, I said coldly. You made your choices. You burned your bridges. And now you want me to rebuild them for you? That's not how this works. She looked up at me then, eyes wide and wet, mascara bleeding into the creases of her face. Eleanor, I'm begging you. I'll do anything. Please, just help me. Her desperation was almost surreal. And for a brief second, I saw a glimpse of the woman beneath all the makeup, the arrogance, the money. Just a frightened, hollow shell of a person, terrified of being forgotten. But I wasn't Daniel. I wasn't bound by his kindness anymore. My son was gone, and the only thing I had left was the fire that kept me standing. You wanted me dead in this cabin, I said softly, almost like a reminder to myself. Well, here I am, alive, stronger than you could ever imagine. And you're the one dying inside that mansion. She flinched like I'd struck her. For a moment, I thought she might lash out, scream, claw at me with the rage she had once wielded so easily. But instead, she broke, truly broke. Her body folded in on itself, and she sobbed openly, her shoulders shaking in the rain. I let her cry. I let her sit there until her sobs turned into hiccups, until her breath came in ragged gasps. Then, without another word, I stepped back inside and shut the door. The sound of the latch sliding into place was louder than any scream. Inside, I leaned against the wood, my own heart pounding. This was the moment I had imagined for months. Not revenge through violence or cruelty, but revenge through silence, through refusal, through the denial of mercy she never deserved. That night, as the storm howled outside and Melissa's footsteps finally faded down the path, I realized something important. This was no longer about anger. It was about balance. She had tipped the scales when she cast me aside, and now I had restored them. But the story wasn't over yet. The confrontation at my cabin was only the beginning of her collapse. She still had further to fall, and I would be there, watching, as the last pieces of her empire turned to dust. And though she had begged me for help, she would soon learn the hardest lesson of all. Sometimes silence is the cruelest answer. The news of Melissa's downfall didn't come all at once. It arrived like embers carried on the wind. One here, one there, until suddenly the forest was burning, and nothing could put it out. The first ember was financial. Investors had already begun to pull out months earlier, but now the exodus became undeniable. Articles surfaced about plummeting shares, employees leaving in droves, and the once proud company Daniel built bleeding value faster than anyone could save it. Melissa tried to reassure the public, but every statement she made seemed to fan the flames. Her words had no weight anymore. She was a hollow voice speaking into a storm. The second ember was personal. Photos began circulating online. Melissa shopping at Neiman Marcus, glass of champagne in hand, while her staff unloaded dozens of bags behind her. The irony wasn't lost on the public. The woman who had dismantled her husband's foundation, claiming it was too costly, was living like royalty while Daniel's scholarships and programs lay in ruins. Comment sections turned vicious. Memes ridiculed her greed. Even late-night hosts cracked jokes about the widow who cashed in but can't cash out. But the ember that finally set the forest ablaze came from within the mansion itself. A tell-all surfaced on a niche tech blog. written by none other than Melissa's former assistant. The piece detailed Melissa's temper, her reckless spending, her disdain for Daniel's values, and yes, her cruel eviction of me. Though the assistant didn't name me directly, the phrase, "go die in that cabin," was quoted verbatim. When I read those words printed in black and white, I froze. They'd been echoing in my head for months, but seeing them out in the world, exposed, undeniable, felt like justice itself had found its voice. The piece went viral within days. Suddenly, people weren't just angry at Melissa's incompetence, they were disgusted by her cruelty. Hashtags trended. A petition surfaced demanding she step down from any role in Daniel's company. Even shareholders who had once tolerated her for the sake of appearances turned cold. And just like that, the empire she had stolen was ash. One evening, as twilight stretched long shadows across the redwoods, I heard footsteps again on the gravel path. Slower this time. Heavier. I opened the cabin door before she even knocked. Melissa stood there, not in designer clothes, not even in her neat jeans and sweater. She was disheveled, her hair unbrushed, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked smaller, somehow, like the weight of her collapse had pressed her into the earth. "It's gone," she whispered. "All of it. The company, the respect, the friends, even the money. They froze my accounts pending investigation." Her voice was flat, lifeless, as though she'd already given up. I studied her for a long moment, then stepped aside. For the first time, I led her into the cabin. She sat stiffly in the chair across from me, staring at the wooden walls Daniel had built with his own hands. For once, she didn't fill the silence with excuses or flattery. She just sat there, broken. "Do you know what Daniel used to tell me?" I said, finally, my voice steady. "He said money and power are like sand. The harder you try to hold on, the faster they slip away. What lasts is how you treat people." That's the legacy. Melissa closed her eyes, a tear sliding down her cheek. "And I destroyed it." "Yes," I said simply. "You did." For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The fire crackled between us, casting shadows across the room. I felt no triumph, no gloating satisfaction. Just clarity. Melissa shifted in her chair. "I don't know what to do now. I don't know who I am without all of it." "You could start," I said quietly, "by facing yourself honestly for the first time in your life. Not with excuses, not with empty apologies, but with truth. Daniel built this company to help people. If you can't live in a way that honors that, then you'll always be lost." Her hands trembled in her lap. For once, she didn't argue. We sat in silence for what felt like hours, the storm outside growing softer, the fire burning lower. When she finally rose to leave, she paused at the door. "Eleanor, thank you for letting me sit here, even if you never forgive me." I didn't answer. She didn't wait for one. That night, as I lay in bed beneath the quilt Daniel's grandmother had made, I thought about the strange symmetry of it all. Melissa had taken everything material, but in the end, it was she who wound up empty-handed. I, who had been left with nothing but this cabin, had the one thing she couldn't steal, peace. And that, I realized, was the true revenge, not her humiliation, not her collapse, but my survival. My ability to keep living in the light of Daniel's love while she drowned in the shadows of her greed. I don't know what Melissa's future holds. Maybe she'll rebuild somewhere far from here. Maybe she'll keep spiraling until there's nothing left. But her story is no longer mine to carry. Mine is a story of survival, of patience, of the quiet strength it takes to endure cruelty without becoming cruel yourself. If you've stayed with me this far, through every word, every chapter, it means more than I can say. These stories take countless hours to craft, to piece together with honesty and care. If you found meaning in my journey, consider subscribing. Your support isn't just for me, it's what keeps these stories alive, so others can find their voice too. As I sit now on the porch of the cabin, the redwoods stretching high into the fading light, I feel Daniel here with me. Not in the money, not in the mansion, not in the company, but in the quiet, in the resilience, in the love that endures. Melissa tried to erase me. She failed, because some legacies can't be stolen. They live on in the fire, in the wood, in the strength of a mother's heart. When storms pass, people expect silence. a kind of holy calm that follows the chaos when the world feels washed clean. But when Melissa's empire collapsed, the quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. It pressed down on everything like a fog, filling the spaces where gossip and headlines had once been. For months, Melissa had been the centerpiece of Silicon Valley chatter. Every dinner party, every tech blog, every whisper at country clubs had her name on their lips. Now, she had vanished from view. The mansion gates were closed more often than not. Deliveries ceased, and the once bustling driveway sat empty. From my cabin window, I could see the place shrinking into itself. Gardens untrimmed, lights left off. A property too grand for one woman who had lost her audience. And yet, despite the silence, I could feel her presence lingering. She didn't come to the cabin anymore. No notes, no wine, no pitiful knocks. She was withdrawing into the shell of her own creation, and part of me wondered if that was punishment enough. But the world wasn't quite done with her. One morning, as I walked into town for groceries, I overheard two women talking outside the cafe on Main Street. They had a copy of the San Francisco Chronicle spread between them, and Melissa's name was on the front page again. The article detailed a federal inquiry into her handling of Daniel's estate. Something about misfiled taxes, unreported offshore accounts, and suspicious transfers. The details were technical, but the implication was clear. Melissa wasn't just reckless. She was under investigation. The women shook their heads, clucking their tongues. That poor man, one said. He built something beautiful and she burned it down. I walked past them quietly, hiding the small smile tugging at my lips. Justice had a way of unfolding slowly, like a tide creeping up the shore. Melissa had thought she was untouchable, but even the law was beginning to peel back her armor. Back at the cabin, I sat by the fire with a mug of tea and reread one of Daniel's old journals. His handwriting curved neatly across the page. Success means nothing if it doesn't outlive you in good hands. It's not about wealth, it's about stewardship. Melissa had failed that test spectacularly, but the truth was, I wasn't thinking about her as much anymore. For the first time since Daniel's death, my thoughts were turning inward, toward myself, my own healing, my own future. Revenge had carried me this far, but revenge alone can't sustain a person. At some point, you have to decide what comes after. So, I began to rebuild in small ways. I joined a local book club in San Mateo, something I hadn't done in decades. At first, I felt awkward, sitting among women half my age, discussing novels I hadn't heard of, but slowly, I began to enjoy it. Their laughter, their stories, their warmth reminded me that life still existed beyond grief and bitterness. I also started volunteering at the library, helping with children's reading programs. Watching little ones stumble over their first words, then light up when they finally grasp them, it was healing in a way I can't quite explain. It reminded me of Daniel as a boy, sitting at our kitchen table, eyes wide as I read him stories before bed. For the first time, the cabin wasn't just a place of exile. It was becoming a place of renewal. And yet, Melissa's shadow wasn't completely gone. One evening, as I watered the small garden out front, I saw her car pass by on the road leading away from the mansion. The sleek black sedan looked out of place on the gravel, and for a moment, our eyes met through the windshield. She didn't slow down. She didn't wave. She just kept driving, her face pale and unreadable. Later, I heard rumors in town that she was selling the mansion. Some said she was moving to Los Angeles, others whispered about Europe. No one knew for sure, and honestly, I didn't care. What mattered was that she was leaving. The mansion Daniel built, the empire he created, the wealth he amassed, it had all slipped through her fingers like sand. And though I couldn't reclaim what she had destroyed, I had something better, freedom from her shadow. One night, I sat on the porch with a notebook and began writing for myself. Not revenge, not journals for Daniel, but stories of my own life. The small ones, the first time I drove across the Golden Gate Bridge, the time Daniel and I got lost in Yosemite, the day I planted the rosebush that still blooms outside the cabin. It felt good to put myself back on the page. Melissa's story was ending, but mine wasn't. Mine was still being written, day by day, word by word. If you followed me this far, I want you to know something. telling this story hasn't been easy. Every chapter has meant reliving moments of loss, anger, and quiet pain. Writing them down takes hours and sometimes tears. If you found value in it, if it's touched you in some way, please consider subscribing. It might seem small, but to me, it means that the effort and the hours aren't in vain. Because while Melissa's name may fade from the headlines, while the mansion may be sold to strangers, while the company may move on under new leadership, this story, my story, lives on through those who read it. And as I closed my notebook that night, I realized something profound. Melissa had lost everything because she clung too tightly. I had gained everything because I learned to let go. The quiet after the storm wasn't emptiness. It was peace. It was early spring when the for sale sign finally appeared in front of the mansion. I spotted it while walking down the long gravel road that stretched past Daniel's property. The once pristine lawn had grown wild, ivy climbing unchecked up the stone pillars. The fountain out front had dried up, leaving only cracked stone where water once danced. Melissa's empire had fallen quietly, without the dramatic explosion people might have expected. No paparazzi swarming the gates, no shouting crowds, just silence, emptiness, and a hollow house that no longer belonged to her. Within weeks, moving trucks arrived. Furniture was carried out one piece at a time until the mansion was nothing more than an empty shell. I watched from a distance, leaning on my walking stick, the redwoods towering around me. There was no triumph in seeing the place stripped bare, only a kind of bittersweet clarity. Daniel had built that house out of love, and Melissa had drained it of that love until nothing remained. Now, strangers would walk those halls, sleep in those rooms, unaware of the laughter and arguments and dreams that once filled them. And maybe that was for the best. When the trucks were gone and the gates locked, I stood there a long while, staring at the mansion that had once loomed so large in my life. I realized then that my story was no longer tied to its walls. My story had been here, in the cabin, all along. The cabin Daniel built for me with his own hands had outlasted Melissa's empire. It wasn't grand, it wasn't luxurious, but it was real. Every beam of wood carried his fingerprint, every nail his determination. This was where he had honored me, where he had ensured I would always have a home. No one could take that from me. And in that moment, standing in the shadow of the mansion and the light of my cabin, I understood something deeper than revenge. I had won not because Melissa had lost, but because love endures when greed fades. Melissa, as far as I know, left California. Some said she went east, others whispered Europe again. I never saw her car on the gravel road after that day. And truthfully, I didn't need to. Her chapter in my story had ended. Mine was moving forward. I poured my energy into the library programs, into reading circles, into evenings with the women from my book club. I began baking again, something I hadn't done since Daniel was alive. Apple pies, cinnamon bread, small comforts that filled the cabin with warmth. Sometimes I'd leave a loaf at the library or bring a pie to the club, and people would smile, their gratitude quiet but genuine. Those small acts mattered more to me than any inheritance ever could. One afternoon, I received a letter in the mail. It was from one of the students who had lost their scholarship when Melissa dismantled Daniel's foundation. She had tracked me down through the library. In neat handwriting, she told me she had found another way to finish her degree and was now working as a software engineer in Seattle. I just wanted you to know, she wrote, that Daniel's vision didn't die. He inspired me, and I carry that forward. I wept as I read it, because that right there was the proof I needed. Melissa may have destroyed the programs, but she hadn't destroyed the lives Daniel touched. His legacy wasn't tied to the money, or the mansion, or even the company. It was in people, inspired hearts, lit minds, and the quiet ripple effects of his kindness. And in me, sitting on the porch one evening, the redwoods whispering in the wind, I thought back to the darkest moment, Melissa's voice like poison, telling me to go die in the cabin. At the time, those words had felt like a death sentence. Now I saw them differently. I hadn't died in the cabin. I had lived here, thrived here, rebuilt myself here. The cabin wasn't my prison. It was my sanctuary. I pulled Daniel's journal from the shelf one last time. On the very last page, he had written, "If Mom is reading this, I want you to know The cabin is more than wood and nails. It's my way of keeping you close. No matter what happens, you'll always have a home. His words wrapped around me like a blanket. Melissa was gone. The mansion was empty. The company would rebuild in new hands. But the cabin stood strong, carrying Daniel's love forward, grounding me in a world that had tried to uproot me. This is where I'll remain. Not as a victim, not as a woman cast aside, but as a survivor who found strength in silence, in patience, in love. So, to those of you who've walked this journey with me through every chapter, I want to say thank you. Sharing this story has been more than catharsis. It's been connection. Each word has been carved from memory. Each chapter a piece of my soul. It has taken hours upon hours to shape it all into something I could give to you. If you found meaning here, if my story has touched something in you, please consider subscribing. Your support ensures these stories don't vanish into silence, that voices like mine continue to be heard. Because at the end of the day, stories are what remain. Mansions crumble, money fades, reputations collapse, but stories endure. And mine ends here, not with bitterness, not with revenge, but with peace. Melissa's world turned to ashes. Mine is rooted in love. And love, I've learned, outlives everything.